Welcome to another episode of Patterns and Stories. Joining us today is Dag Detter, a Swedish author and investment advisor who has led the restructuring of the government portfolio of public assets during the reforms of 1998-2001 as the former president of Stattum and director at the Swedish Ministry of Industry. We are your hosts, Luca Delana and Ismail Manik.
When we talk about public finances, we often talk about the budget, whether that is in a surplus or in a deficit. And then we talk about the debt. We seldom or never talk about the assets or even other liabilities like pensions. So we forget about the balance sheet. If we were talking corporate language, or even for a private person, we have a P&L or a budget, as it's called in government, the profit and loss. That is the whole focus. And then we look at debt and we forget about assets. We don't even see them because we don't consider that we actually have a balance sheet with two sides, both assets and liabilities. We only focus on the very small part of the debt, which is we are missing an opportunity to manage those assets much better. But we're also creating a risk by not seeing the other liabilities, which is often much larger than the debt.
Just to make a concrete example, next to where I live, there are a few buildings owned by the government, a theater, for example, that is closed currently. So this, for example, would be an example of an asset which is probably underutilized, so undervalued, and not taken into account by traditional metric. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Real estate is probably the biggest segment of public assets because it's the most hidden part. We often see the operational assets, the companies, the publicly owned companies, such as state-owned banks or locally owned banks or manufacturing, electricity companies, water systems, train systems, airports, ports, etc. We see those, but they are also seldom mismanaged, and also not really recognized on the balance sheet because we don't think about a balance sheet in government. But yes, the real estate is usually worth 1 times the economic output of a city, of a state, of a federal government. So it's rather large. Real estate alone is worth more than the debt of most countries, probably even in Italy. And then on top of that, you have operational assets like state-owned companies, you have water systems, electricity, trains, airports, etc.
What are your suggestions to improve the way in which these assets are managed?
Well, I mean, if we go down to a individual level, many people have an income from work, but then they also have savings, ideally, maybe in a portfolio of shares or bonds or something. And we would ideally want to have an income both from the work, but also from the assets that we have saved. I mean, the investments that we have made. In a government, they have more assets. The assets are more valuable than all the debt. In other words, they have a net worth, they are wealthy. And if we only look at the debt, we will always think that we are poor and we don't have resources to invest for the future, for next generation. So we are basically starving society of investments. And more importantly, if we are only looking at the debt, we are not making a differentiation whether we are borrowing money to invest in important things like infrastructure, housing, and those things that could generate revenue and could benefit to society. We're also not doing maintenance. And that's one of the reasons. Because of poor accounting, because of poor asset management in government, in the public sector, we have a lot of derelict infrastructure. And we are lacking a lot of infrastructure, not the least housing, which is critical to create economic growth and mobility. Mobility, the ability to move where work is, where there's an opportunity, is critical for a society to grow. It's also critical for social mobility.
So if I understand correctly, what you're saying is that if we properly accounted for the value of the assets, for the value of mobility, and if we kept updating those values for taking into account the maintenance or the depreciation due to lack of maintenance and so on, all this accounting would favor investment because we will see the value and we will see the value of not doing that. And the fact
Yes.
that we are not taking all those things into account is, let's say, disincentivizing investment in infrastructure.
I mean, there's a famous saying in finance that says, show me the incentive, I'll show you the outcome. And if you don't recognize, if you don't see your assets, you will not manage them because you don't see them. You can't manage what you don't see. And if you don't see it, you will not invest because you can't see that it's derelict. Of course, you can walk on the streets and your people will tell you, but especially for a state government, they're often so remote from the actual assets. In a local government, you will know very well what streets are not maintained, how much housing is lacking, etc., and bridges are falling apart. But since we're not measuring this, I mean, first of all, we don't have a system that will tell us where is it? Is it value? Is it maintained? Is it managed well? Do we need to put more money in it? Is something lacking? And that's why we have these surprises with bridges falling down all of a sudden, not the least in Italy, but you have it everywhere. And you also have no incentives for the people in charge, the bureaucrats and the politicians, to actually make the investments. Nobody is incentivized. If politicians are incentivized to get re-elected. But if we don't measure how they have used the money, we will not be able to tell whether they have used the money wisely and should be re-elected.
And according to you, who should be in charge of those measurements?
It should be, I mean, the Ministry of, there needs to be a checks and balance like everything in life. So, of course, I mean, the Ministry of Finance in a local government, state government, or national government should be producing financial statements, if not monthly, at least quarterly, and they should be timely, so they're not lagging in time, because the issue with financial statements is not so much transparency, which is often talked about. Financial statements is the numbers, the data that you have for making wise decisions. So having them being produced too late, then they are of no use for the politicians or any other stakeholders to actually be able to do proper decisions. So, for instance, in New Zealand, which is the prime example in this regard, they have monthly statements, which allows them to take timely and proper decisions with accurate data. And then, of course, it should be audited numbers. So you need to have an auditor, and you need to have, other stakeholders who actually check that it's accurate. But the first check is, of course, the auditors. So they need to be audited numbers.
One implication of this kind of approach means that you have to have an accrual accounting system in the government. And I think your suggestions maybe in most OECD countries, they probably do. It's across the public sector, you don't have accrual accounting is kind of not fully implemented in a sense. What are your thoughts on the accounting system?
Yeah, great. I just wanted to remind that accrual accounting is when revenues and expenses are recognized when they are incurred, rather than when cash transaction pass hands.
To make that simple, I mean, a cash accounting is so simple. It's what you receive in a bank statement, or when you look at your credit card. It's what comes in cash and what goes out in cash. It doesn't tell you anything if you have borrowed money to buy a car. It doesn't register the car's value. It doesn't register your house value or the money you have borrowed for that, or if the house has gone up in value or down in value, if you had done maintenance, or if you have invested in your house, etc. Nothing is recorded. So it's really flying blind, because you would never be able to go to the bank and just say, I'd like to borrow money to mend my roof. They would say no if they just look at your bank statement. But if they saw that the value of the house had gone up, they would say, of course, your net worth, your debt on the house is very small. We'll be very happy to lend you because the asset is worth so much. That's a more holistic approach, and that's how you need to do it. We do, every individual do it, every corporate would die without doing this. And the private sector would not survive without looking at balance sheets and the profit and loss account. But governments, since they have the power to tax, have just been very lazy. Using tax and debt is also based on your taxing ability, which means that we have just been lazy not to require them to have proper accounting and proper asset management. and liability management for that matter.
Now, going back to Ismail's question about accounting systems in some countries.
Now, I mean, of course, the accounting systems are not good. If you don't have accrual accounting and if you don't link the budget to the balance sheet, you, of course, do not understand what you're doing. This is like driving a car, I would almost say blindfolded, but at least it's like driving a car on a high-speed motorway, but not with Google helping you, but rather with a map from the 16th century. It's pretty useless. And that's the second myth in public finance, that accrual accounting is difficult, time-consuming, and expensive. All those three are myths and you should get rid of them as soon as possible. Because accrual accounting is not rocket science. It's done in the private sector every day. It's done by private individuals. So everybody will understand what it is. And it doesn't take a very long time to do, which is proven by, especially New Zealand, but also other countries. And it's not very costly. When people are referring to the cost, they often are referring to that they need to change an IT system, which they will have to do anyway. And that cost is absolutely marginal compared to the revenues, the non-tax revenues, and that you can generate from better management and from understanding your finances better, but also from limiting the fiscal risk that you have by not having proper accounting. So there's really only upsides with this. But still, bureaucrats and politicians are dragging their feet because it takes political will. It's not a technical, it's not a financial, it's not a fiscal problem to introduce accrual accounting and to link the budget with the balance sheet. It's only a political challenge.
One thing you referred earlier was about pensions. And what do you think the intergenerational issues, how would this approach, would it impact the discussions on intergenerational issues and equity?
Well, intergenerational issue or the intergenerational issue is twofold, I would say. It's both on the asset side and on the liability side. On the liability side, to start there, if we don't fund our pensions properly, it will impact the next generations or future generations because they will have to pay then from their taxes for our pensions or for the people who are eligible for getting a pension payout. So that's very unfair if we haven't set the system in place which actually properly funds the pension that we promise the pension holders. That is extremely unfair to younger generations because that will increase their tax burden. It will increase their debt if the government has to borrow to pay for those pensions. Now, on the asset side, same thing. If we don't have the incentive systems to incentivize politicians to invest in water systems, in electricity systems, in energy production, in roads, in airports, in ports, but just run these for cash, because then they will have to pay for that, either by that country or that city will be less economically viable or even bankrupt, or by the fact that they will have to pay for massive investment. And this is something we can see all over the world, especially in water systems, where you can hide the lack of investments, not for 10 years, sometimes for hundreds of years. So it's very important to have the visibility on how the assets are managed and their status, and also the incentive systems to make it worthwhile for politicians to actually spend the money wisely, not just consume to get re-elected.
Thank you, Dag. I think that this point you make is very important. I expect that some listeners will immediately grasp the importance of what you mentioned, and others maybe will not see it so evident. And the reason why it's not so evident is precisely because right now we're not accounting for those things. And it's very easy to go without maintenance on the highway for a while. And the lesson we get is not that maintenance is important and we should do it, but it's we got away with not doing maintenance and we can probably keep getting away with it, which is completely wrong. And so that's why I see so welcome this approach that you suggest, in which we are making the problems visible as they start occurring without waiting for them to be catastrophic.
Yeah, I mean, it's a psychological issue, I would say. I mean, it's the same thing to some people are very well prepared to move and buy their own house or apartment. And they can barely afford it, but they're happy to live a little bit more lean a few years in order to have a better way of living. I mean, a better house or living standard. And same thing, but some people will not be bothered. They rather spend the money now rather than think that long term. I mean, so that's call it a psychological problem, but even more difficult, it's with health. Because with health, it's not as apparent when you are trying to live healthy today, because you might not see the effect until maybe 30 or 50 years later. So it takes a lot of discipline. It takes a lot of education to not go have a quick fix for things, but rather the discipline and the long-term sights to actually live healthy and save money. These can be perceived as rather boring, but when you have the responsibility for many people in a country or in a city, it's quite critical that the leadership are disciplined and have that kind of long-term perspective instead of the quick fixes that will make them re-elected. But for that matter, that's why we need to have the incentive system that incentivize them to actually think long term. We need to demand that they think long term.
Just quoting from Martin Wolf had a forward to your last book. It's always far better to be roughly right than to be precisely wrong. How do you, given the politics, and how do you convince the average person that this approach will be better, as you mentioned, you were comparing with regard to the approach we take to health and fitness. So what are the things that we could actually encourage do in this area, given the complicated nature of the issue?
Well, my work is a little bit like being a doctor. People don't really, come to see me until it's too late, unfortunately. It's very hard to tell people, who are smoking or whatever, that you should stop smoking. I mean, not many people are prepared to listen to these things because they enjoy the stimuli that a cigarette gives them for the moment, while other people would never even consider smoking. And you have that with many of the things that stimulate our our brain short term. Many things are built this way, but so of course, getting rid of smoking or whatever it is, it takes a lot of convincing education. So I don't think there's one quick argument apart from a crisis. A crisis will teach everybody. Everybody will listen. There's no discussion. But to make people in advance change, or a society change, it takes a very clever politician. It's not technical. I don't think it's technical things that's going to change people. It's psychological, emotional things that are going to make them see things in a different light.
Last night we did a recording on Sri Lanka economic crisis and the reforms they brought. One thing that was discussed was with regard, they tried to include what is called governance-linked indicator into the debt instrument. These kind of, what do you think, in terms of net worth-based fiscal rules are kind of important element in terms of reforms. What do you think about incorporating such in terms of fiscal rules, or kind of binding the legislator on some of these aspects of?
For me, fiscal rules, all kinds of rules, has to be very simple. And in fact, we have done the evaluation of the assets in Sri Lanka. And it turned out that they are significantly higher than the debt. So the country is actually, as presumed, extremely rich, but is not using those assets. It's not managing the assets properly. And before we did the valuation, the finance minister and the president didn't even know that they had these assets. So, and there are enormous opportunities in Sri Lanka to manage the assets better, to have a yield and non-tax revenues from them. So, but to incentivize that, I think net worth is, one of the better fiscal measures to look at, to incentivize that we are actually investing and managing, increasing the value and doing the maintenance, etc., and developing assets for the benefit of society as a whole. Because it's simple. Everybody is looking at their net worth. Individuals do it, corporates do it. So it's immediately recognizable by everybody. And that is important. I mean, it's like if you try to keep healthy or even improve your health by training, you don't want to look at your weight over your age, which is, for me, what debt over GDP is. There are two completely irrelevant factors. They don't mix with each other. But if you look at the assets minus liabilities, that's relevant. It's like looking at your weight and put it in relation to your length. Then you can start understanding, yes, it's either a lot of muscles, but of course it's better if you can really measure how the composition, if you can measure how much fat you have, etc., then you will understand, well, you are very fit because it's mainly muscles, apart from the water, of course. It's more muscles than fat. And that's the important thing. You have invested in your body and not, a meaningless measurement like debt over GDP. It doesn't tell you anything.
In your books, I think covered New Zealand as well as some discussion of Singapore. What are the good practices that you could learn from the New Zealand case in terms of developing long-term fiscal sustainability, and in terms of in the Singapore case about their national wealth management? Can you tell us a little bit what we could learn from those countries, or any other examples that?
Sure. Singapore is to asset management what New Zealand is to accounting. So, New Zealand is the best example we have. They've had 30 years of accrual accounting and linking the balance sheet to the budget, which has, as the IMF has commented a number of times, having a strong net worth is the best way to recover from a crisis or from a shock. It is also a way to have a lower cost of capital, lower cost of debt. It also enables you to react quicker when you are in a crisis. And New Zealand is as prone to natural disasters as Bangladesh in terms of from an insurance perspective. So they have many natural disasters. And over these 30 years, they've had 2 earthquakes that has been devastating. They've had 2 financial crises and the pandemic. And all of these crises that hit the economy quite significantly, they were able to recover very quickly and has increased their net worth over these 30 years, despite these setbacks. So that is a testament to why it's important to have accrual accounting, because it gives you the financial information to react quickly. It gives you the financial reserves to pay for those measures that you need to do when you have difficulty. And it also prepares you for the future and creates trust in a society that the government is there to help us when we run into difficult times. Now, Singapore was once part of Malaysia, and Malaysia is one of the richest countries when it comes to natural resources, oil, whatever. They have everything. And the two parts had the same GDP per capita when Singapore was thrown out of Malaysia in the 1960s. Now, Singapore doesn't have anything of the riches that Malaysia has. At that time, they didn't have even the capacity to generate electricity or food. So they were thrown out and had to invent, how are we going to survive financially and physically? And they understood that taking care of the assets and everything that the government owned needed professionals. So they separated policymaking from commercial management. So the electricity system that they built, the water system that they built, the real estate that they built, everything, the ports that they built, they put under commercial management in a separate holding company called Temasek. And they also had the discipline to create a budget surplus. So today, the wealth funds that they have created to manage this surplus and the operational and real estate assets inside the country is today contributing 7% of GDP every year. Temasek alone has a total shareholder return of 15%. It's as good as any private sector investment manager. And the wealth that they have created over these 60 years is the biggest wealth portfolio in the world. It's bigger than any of the wealth funds in Norway, Saudi Arabia, etc., that are based on natural resources from gas and oil. And that's pretty amazing. That shows you that pure discipline, management, and professionalism can actually create a country which once was a developing nation, it went from a developing economy to a developed in one generation.
What do you think the role of, say, this is mostly for emerging and developing countries, the role of the World Bank and the IMF in terms of standards? And so IMF has this government finance statistics manual, which I think that most of the countries are still not fully implemented the new GFS system. So what do you think their role should be in terms of pushing this idea of generating these government balance sheets and the importance of it?
Well, it's also already, I mean, accrual accounting is already in the public financial manuals of the IMF. So that's good. Probably what needs to happen is that it's connected to professional management of both assets and liabilities, and that you connect the balance sheet with the budget so that you actually use proper accounting and then initiate it also in the instruments that are used daily by the IMF and the World Bank, like Article 4 and debt sustainability analysis, because that would incentivize countries when they need help or technical assistance, that this is the template, this is the best practice to aim for, and of course offer technical assistance to the countries that need it, and come out with a message that this is the gold standard, this is where what you should aim for, and no, it's not difficult. We can help you, and within a year or 18 months, you will have it, and you will be there, and you will benefit.
Yeah, thank you. I think that this point you mentioned is very important of the standard. Like, I think that a lot of people here in many countries, they don't see what's possible. They overestimate how difficult it is. They underestimate the benefits. So thank you very much for that. One question we ask all guests is, what is one question that you wish we would ask you, but somehow usually you are not asked and you wish you could talk about more?
I'll also add two final questions. One is with regard to AI, and what do you think these new technologies or software, I think it gives more agency to, say, Ministry of Finance or to implement really good reforms. And the other is we ask all our guests about some book recommendation besides the three books that you have published. Any new that you are writing, or any other general book recommendations on the theme we discussed today?
I don't know if the book is completely related. I'm currently reading a book called Stuck by Joni Appelbaum, and it's about the importance of housing for local governments, of course, but also for national governments, and why housing is the engine of growth, because it enables mobility, social mobility, but also physical mobility. So that is definitely a book I find extremely fascinating, and a great complement to this whole debate about the need for more investment in housing. I mean, for me, it's simple. I mean, governments own 50% of the real estate market and sitting on a portfolio which is worth 1 times GDP. And they're also sitting on the regulation and the zoning and everything. So really, they are sitting on all the instruments possible to create more and better housing, which will benefit society enormously. So there's really no excuse for them to just sit and wait for the private sector to do this. They are the best placed institution to actually improve housing conditions in every country, every city, every state. When it comes to AI and all the modern tools that are emerging, I think that's foremost. Of course, it takes away all the excuses that accrual accounting is difficult. But more importantly, for real estate, it could really help tracking and valuing real estate more efficiently. Of course, when we do the financial statements, we need to have certified valuers and everything. Just today, every country, including Sri Lanka, Pakistan, everywhere that we do this, it takes only a few weeks to get this data, an asset map of the real estate in the whole country done. It's not difficult. Of course, that could be done much quicker with AI. And when it comes to the final message, if you like, and I think to politicians, and that is, find out today what your assets are worth and act on it tomorrow. It's not difficult. It really just takes a few weeks in any country, and there's no excuse, because it will benefit you and it will benefit society as a whole and the country and the city that you are managing.
Thank you so much. I think it's such an important message, and I really hope that more countries listen to it and take action on it very soon. Thank you so much for having taken the time, Dag.
Thank you very